Zimbabwe is a failed state. What we have is on the picture there is the face of what the consequences of a failed state might be. Over 50% of Zimbabweans today live in abject poverty. And their poverty, ironically, is a deliberate and calculated move by the ruling party. Zanu PF has kept particularly the rural people deliberately poor for its own political gain. In 1970, the economist and banker John Robertson advised Ian Smith that Zimbabwe's blacks in the rural area would contribute even more to the economy, the well-being of the economy, if they were granted title deeds to even a very small piece of land on which their houses are built, because it will give them the motivation to build a better house, dig a well to make sure there's clean water, build toilet facilities, plant fruit trees, improve that piece of land. And if they wanted to build an even better house, they could go to the bank and get a loan. The bank will have the house as its collateral. But Ian Smith said no. And the simple reason for it is he feared that give the blacks property rights and economic empowerment, the next thing they would want is political rights, a meaningful say in the governance of the country. After independence, John Robertson tabled the same proposal to Robert Mugabe, and he too rejected it, and for exactly the same reasons. Zanu PF has deliberately kept particularly the rural poor for its own political reasons. That is the nub of it, and it is tragic. Here is Margaret Dongo, herself a former Zanu PF MP who fell out with the regime, explaining that very point.
They have wrong priorities, especially the current government. How can you go and build an airport which services a few people, and the majority are the elite and the so-called investors? Look at the rural. I made you come to interview me because I wanted you to have the experience of the roads that we are using. If we go today to our hospital there, you feel pity with that's a hospital in a rural area. If we go to our clinic, you feel pity. We have no piped water here. Do you know the reason why the rural people vote for Zanu PF? One, they're intimidated. Two, the policy is that the rural people should remain poor and subservient to the government. They should remain poor, because if they remain poor, they continue singing the song for their master. This is why these people have been impoverished. It's for a reason. Because at the moment, if you economic empower these people, they'll go out of hand. Zanu PF will never have control over them.
So here we are. There is the face of somebody who is a victim of the regime. The gentleman is wearing a Zanu PF t-shirt, no doubt given to him during last year's elections. And it's probably his best Sunday wear. And in the background is his heart. How anyone could call such a structure a home in this, the 21st century, beggars belief. But that's where we are. The question one has got to ask is, how did we get here? The truth is, many of the Zanu PF leaders actually well appreciated the evils of white tyrannical oppression, and they were convinced that Zanu PF would not become the next oppressors. Here is an interview with one Edson Shobo, one of the very bright minds in Zanu PF in the first few decades soon after independence.
How can you be certain that whatever government you set up won't eventually become oppressive, won't be the sort of society where people are frightened of speaking out, frightened of doing anything without looking over their shoulder?
We do not want to create a socio-legal order in the country in which people are petrified, in which people go to bed having barricaded their doors and their windows because someone belonging to the special branch of the police will break into their houses. This is what we've been fighting against. Every one of us has been in jail 10 years, 14 years. I myself 9 without trial. Every one of us has had to leave scared of the police. How on earth could we create a society which is exactly like that? We don't want it. We are fed up of it. And this is why we are in this revolution for as long as is necessary to abolish this system.
The truth is, they've created a political system that is even more oppressive and corrupt than the white regime. In 1980, excuse me, Zimbabwe was an upper middle income country, way on its way to really giving all its people a decent living standard. It has since destroyed the economy to the point where we are one of the poorest countries in Africa. And on the political front, while the whites deny the blacks the vote, the Zanu PF has allowed what some people call electoral autocracy, where you have the vote, but it only counts if it's a vote for Zanu PF. And the regime has become so oppressive, it's unreal. How did we get here? I think that is a very useful and important question. In an interview with Trevor Nuwe, Dr. Simba Makone explained how Zimbabwe took the wrong turn almost soon after independence.
I recall very clearly that when we came into office in 1980, we inherited Ian Smith's systems. And Ian Smith's ministers drove Peugeot 504s. They drove themselves from home to work in their Land Rovers and all in kinds. Most of them were farmers. They parked their Land Rover and then they used the government vehicle when they were at work. with a chauffeur. When they finished at night, they packed them and they took theirs to go home. Within the month of our coming into office, Prime Minister Mugabe then directed that every minister be issued with an E-class Mercedes-Benz, and the Peugeot 504s were retired to permanent secretaries, and the deputy ministers who then took over. We can also look at many other things, small they may appear at the time. Let me hazard that even at that point, Enos Nkala was our Minister of Finance. I don't think we knew what budget we inherited from Ian Smith when the decision was taken to buy those E-class fleets for the ministers. So the material affection for material things has always been with us. And the differentiation also, even going back into the camps, Zemashefu, Neze, my comrades, Makada, were not the same. So much so that even today, when the so-called Minister for Presidential Affairs or Provincial Governor, as they were, goes to Bubi or Binga, they will be served separately and differently from the other people. The avarice grew as we began to exploit the opportunities of office. When I was in the government, the minister was allocated one vehicle that they kept, which was the sedan they used in town. If you needed to go off-road, then your ministry hired off-road vehicles from the CMED, and you were charged for it. Now a minister will have an average of 4 vehicles in his forecourt, all at government's expense.
So the leadership modeled the wrong kind of behavior, and that kind of behavior permeated all across our society. Our CEOs, like you're saying, heads of parastatals and so forth, modeled from the top.
Indeed. Indeed. I made a passing reference that we have CEOs who will buy themselves a luxury car when they can't pay wages at the end of the week or end of the month. This has been so entrenched in our psyche, this showing off, as if you are a different person. You're breathing different air from those who don't drive Prados and Land Cruisers, from those who don't drive Jeep Cherokees. We have lost our...
I'll stop it there. This is what got Zimbabwe on the wrong track. Mugabe bribed his fellow Zanu PF leaders with the trappings of high office. And they forgot the values that Edson Job was talking about earlier on. They became even more oppressive than the white regime they were seeking to replace. Their greed superseded what even they thought possible. And this is what is at the heart of why Zimbabwe is a failed state. It's interesting, actually, to note that during the GNU of 2008 to 2013, when the opposition had the golden opportunity to implement the democratic reforms which would have ended the Zanu PF dictatorship, Mugabe applied the same dirty tactic on Morgan Tsvangirai and company. He saw to it that they also got the E-class ministerial limos, the very generous salaries and allowances, and for Morgan Tsvangirai, the US $4 million house. This was an individual whose house, until he got into government, was probably worth 30,000, 40,000 at most. All of a sudden now he's living in a $4 million mansion. Of course, they forgot about the reforms. Indeed, the Zanu PF cronies used to boast that mazwane MDC yadzidza kudya Nyerere. When they were asked why was MDC leaders not implementing the reforms, Mugabe bribed them and they were not going to rock the boat. And so the opportunity to implement the democratic reforms to end Zanu PF dictatorship was wasted. Ever since the GNU, MDC CCC leaders have participated in flawed elections, knowing fully well that they are flawed, knowing fully well that by participating, they were only perpetuating Zanu PF dictatorship. But such was their greed and their resolve to participate that Nelson Chamisa, for instance, was prepared to lie to his followers, telling them that I have plugged all the vote rigging loopholes just to get them to participate in those flawed elections. It's most unfortunate, of course, that the followers believed it. I've gone back to Edson Jobo because I think he has put his finger on one of the reasons why this has happened. Why Zimbabweans have failed the test to govern themselves, to govern ourselves. In this quotation, Edson Jobo argues that the reason is what he called the Mozambique syndrome. And this is how he explains it. Whenever they lost an argument, meaning his fellows Zanu PF leaders, when we were in Mozambique, they would accuse you of being a CIA to avoid the substantive issues. Today, they call you an American puppet. I think he had put his finger on the right problem there. Zimbabweans have had this weakness of failing to focus on the substantive issues. They've always wanted the easy way out, the bolt hole. It is very common, even today, when we're discussing about Zimbabwe having failed to hold free, fair, and credible elections for 44 years and counting. Each time you say Zanu PF rigged the elections and give the reasons why. The Zanu PF supporters don't want to know. The first temptation is to dismiss you as a puppet of the West. What has got rigging elections to do with the West? Holding free, fair, and credible elections would be for the benefit of all Zimbabweans. And yet, instead of discussing it, why do you say that Zanu PF rigged the elections? Then I can explain to you why I say that. You want to quickly take the quick route out. Because once they've dismissed you as a puppet of the West, it's almost like there's no point in me talking to you. You don't understand. You're a puppet. And if you say, as some of us have said, that MDC Triple C have sold out by failing to implement even one token reform in 24 years, including the 5 in the GNU. The MDC Triple C Nelson Chamisa supporters will immediately dismiss you as a Zanu PF CIO. And once they pigeonholed you, there's no point in taking the discussion any further. They pigeonholed you, you are a Zanu PF CIO. They do not waste their time talking to a CIO. This, as Edson Shobo called it, Mozambique syndrome, has been applied in our politics to the point of giving those who do not want to discuss the substantive issues the bolt hole to get them away from discussing substantive issues. This has not helped the nation. The truth of the matter is Zanu PF has rigged the elections, and the country is in a serious economic and political mess. And we are not going to get out of it without dealing with our political paralysis. Chamisa has repeatedly lied to the people of Zimbabwe. And so has Zanu PF. And what is disappointing here is the Zimbabwean electorate have been so naive and gullible. They've been taken advantage of again and again. Soon after independence, for instance, the worst thing anyone can say was to criticize Robert Mugabe. He was untouchable. Even at the peak of the infamous Kukura Wundi in 1983 to 1987, many people would not accept that Mugabe is a dictator, a murderous one for that matter. They would not accept it. If anything was going wrong, they would blame the ministers around him, forgetting that he was the one who was appointing and sometimes recycling the same corrupt and incompetent ministers. I liked the American President Truman. It is said that he had on his desk a sign that says the buck stops here. In other words, he is the president and he's got to take responsibility. In the case of Mugabe, people would not accept that Mugabe could be corrupt and incompetent. It must be the ministers. Alas, the same mentality has been transferred to Chamisa. Although Chamisa has repeatedly failed to implement even one democratic reform in 24 years of MDC Triple C. Last year, he blatantly lied about plugging the vote rigging loopholes. There are some people out there who find that totally unacceptable. They cannot swallow that. They cannot admit that Chamisa is corrupt, incompetent, and a liar. They still want to hang on to Chamisa as the savior of the country. How can somebody who has already proven to be so corrupt and incompetent that they failed to implement even one token reform in 24 years, including 5 in the GNU, who was lying about something as obvious as failing to implement reforms, who was lying about participating in last year's elections without something as basic as a verified voter's roll. He claimed he still Triple C was going to win big. How could somebody like that still be trusted to be the nation's best foot forward? It beggars belief. The truth of the matter is, Zimbabwe is in a bad place. The failed state has left the country in a serious economic and political situation. This is totally unsustainable. Right now, the country in the next few days, will be hosting the SADC summit. The amount of military oppression that the regime has organized is unbelievable. There have been videos on social media showing soldiers and police patrolling in rural areas. That's how much the regime is prepared to go. And yet, the regime is failing to supply and maintain even most basic services like healthcare, supply clean water to the people, education, and yet is spending millions of dollars in making sure that the army, the police, the CIO are armed to the teeth. Zimbabwe has become the North Korea police state of Africa. And what is more disappointing is the regime is dug in and is determined to hang on to power at all costs. Here is my last video clip of Mnangagwa insisting that last year's elections were free, fair, and credible, although SADC, the AU, have all condemned them as flawed.
Vana vakatuka Zanu PF kana ini ndonyanyisa kufara ndokutiri kuita zvakanaka. Ukavona vavengi vako vachikurumbidza nekuchikanganisa, ukavona vachiti Zanu PF yakaipa, farai. You are doing correct things for your country. Hongu takaita maelections edu kuna vamwe vaitaura zvisina musoro zvikanzi maelection anafamba zvakanaka ndezvavo.
We can deny it all we want. The truth of the matter is, Zimbabwe is ruled by a corrupt, incompetent, and tyrannical regime that has rigged the elections to stay in power. the very thing that people went to war to fight to end, they saw in the white colonial regime is the very thing that Zanu PF has become. What is the way forward? I think the way forward is we are not going to get Zanu PF to implement any reforms between now and 2028. That to me is obvious. We are not going to stop Chamisa and company participating in those flawed elections because their greed is well known. Indeed, if they were to boycott elections in 2028, that would be hypocrisy on their part, because they participated in elections with no reforms since 2013. What has changed? I think what we are likely to see is Chamisa and company coming up with yet another idiotic excuse why people should participate in the flawed elections, claiming that this time the party is going to win. They have got ways, strategies of winning rigged elections. We do not want to reinvent the wheel. We do not want rigged elections. We already know what constitutes free, fair, and credible elections. We should stand firm in our demand for democratic reforms, or will not participate in the flawed elections. I believe if Zimbabweans do not participate in 2028 elections in the same numbers that participated last year, I believe SADC will do the right thing and deny Zanu PF political legitimacy. We should not be conned by Chamisa into participating in flawed elections to give Zanu PF political legitimacy again. That is my message to the people of Zimbabwe tonight. Thank you very much for listening, and have a good day.